Alright guys, let's dive into the digestive system. And of course, I had to start with a stupid ass pun, right? You guys ever read this book as a kid? I know I did. Okay, we're going to split this up a little bit differently compared to how we do this normally. So normally we discuss the anatomy of a particular system and then we discuss the physiology. Here I've broken it up into I've broken the digestive tract up into all the individual organs, such as the mouth and throat, the stomach, small intestine, etc. And then what we're going to do here is we're going to individually discuss the anatomy of each and then the physiology of each before we move on. So first we're going to start in the mouth and throat, and then we're going to move into the stomach. The stomach leads into the small intestine, and your small intestine is where most of your digestion takes place. And your small intestine can't do this all by itself. It needs help from what's called the accessory organs, and your accessory organs include the liver, gallbladder, and pancreas. Your small intestine will feed into the large intestine, and the large intestine empties into the colon and rectum, although as we'll see, the colon and rectum is technically part of the large intestine. From start to finish, food takes about 18 to 30 hours to fully digest, to go from mouth and throat all the way out the other end. And what determines whether it takes shorter or longer depends on what's in the food and how much there is of it. So here's the anatomy of our digestive tract, all the way from beginning to end, and just showing some of the more, not external anatomy, but some of the bigger parts here. We'll dive a little bit deeper into each of these parts as we come to them. Remember, we start with the mouth and throat, right here, and our mouth includes the tongue, and it includes our salivary glands. We have 3 salivary glands: the parotid gland, and that's right next to our ear, the sublingual gland, which is underneath our tongue, and the submandibular gland, which is underneath our mandible. These salivary glands help to secrete saliva, which contain digestive enzymes. Once we've chewed our food and we've secreted saliva all over it, we're going to move that food through the food tube, the esophagus, and first through the throat, first through the pharynx and into the esophagus. And from the esophagus we move into the stomach. From the stomach, we go into the small intestine, and the small intestine, this middle part right here. And the small intestine is made of 3 major areas: the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. We get input from other organs. We get enzymes, and we get additional support from other organs, including the liver and the gallbladder, along with your pancreas. So food will move through the small intestine before making its way into the large intestine, and the large intestine has lots of parts too. It has a part where it's going up, that's called the ascending colon, the part where it's going across, that's called the transverse colon, going down, that's called the descending colon, an S-shaped part called the sigmoid colon. Sigmoid actually means S. The rectum, and then the anal canal. So that's your large intestine. Okay. So, broadly speaking, we can say that there are two types of structures in the digestive system. There's the gastrointestinal tract, also known as the alimentary canal. So the GI tract and the alimentary canal are just one part of your digestive system. This includes, the way I like to think about this is this includes all the things that food has to pass through. So this includes your mouth, your pharynx, remember pharynx means throat, your esophagus, stomach, small intestine, large intestine, and anus. The accessory glands usually, as a good rule of thumb, never directly come into contact with food. They just help with the digestion of food. So your teeth and your tongue, right away we kind of broke our rule here, but technically you don't need your teeth and tongue to digest food. However, you do need your salivary glands, you need your liver, you need your pancreas, and in most cases you need your gallbladder. So those are your accessory organs of the digestive system. What does your digestive system do? It helps you to take in and break down food, helps you to move those food molecules from your digestive system into your bloodstream, and anything that we don't like, anything that we can't break down, we just move out the other end. And that includes things like fiber. We are going to break down and absorb or move food, 4 types of food: And these four types of food correspond to our four biological molecules. Everything living is made of these four biological molecules, including the things that we eat, and including us. So four types of nutrients are carbs, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. And we will digest and we will absorb these different nutrients in different areas of our digestive tract. Okay, let's focus on the mouth. So I have a little summary here for us of what happens in each section of the GI tract. Notice I left out the accessory organs here. We're just focusing on the GI tract in this table. So in the mouth, we are moving food. That's what motility refers to, as movement of food. And when we're moving food, we're chewing and we're swallowing it. When we swallow it, we kind of pack it. We use our tongue to pack it into this little ball called a bolus. So we say a bolus of food moves down the esophagus. We also secrete lots of stuff from our mouth, mostly saliva. Okay, we actually secrete about 1.5 liters of saliva per day. And then in terms of fluids and food that we take in, on average, that's about 2.5 liters a day. We actually do start digestion in our mouth. So we have enzymes in our saliva. One particular enzyme is called amylase, if you've ever heard of that one. And those enzymes, they specialize in converting polysaccharides to disaccharides. So they convert polysaccharides like starch into disaccharides like sugar. So this is why if you hold a cracker in your mouth, like just, a saltine cracker, after a couple minutes it'll actually start to taste sweet because those enzymes in your saliva are converting the starch in the cracker into sweeter carbohydrates, disaccharides. We only start to digest carbs in the mouth though. No lipids, no proteins, nothing else there. We don't really absorb anything in the mouth. There are some medications that we do absorb in the mouth, but those we don't really consider part of normal digestion. So we're going to say that there's no absorption in the mouth. Okay, so look at the mouth. This is a terrifying picture. Alright, so looking at some anatomy first. Your gingiva are your gums. You ever heard of gingivitis? Inflammation of the gums, right? We have our teeth, and then we have our hard palate and soft palate. The hard palate is made of the palatine bone of the skull. With the soft palate, that's made of connective tissue and a little bit of cartilage. So the soft palate, you can actually punch needles through and whatnot to deliver anesthesia, etc. At the back end of the soft palate, we have this little thing that hangs down, the uvula, that helps us to route food as we're swallowing it. And we also have our tonsils visible in the mouth. Remember, we have multiple types of tonsils, and they're distributed all throughout our mouth and our throat. Here's just one of those types, the palatine tonsil, because it's associated with the palate. We got the tongue, and then underneath the tongue we have these little openings for our salivary glands. Our salivary glands are not located directly inside our mouth, they're kind of far away, so they have to have little tubes, little ducts, in order to carry the saliva to the tongue, or rather to the mouth. So, if you ever open your mouth when you're talking to someone and a little bit of saliva kind of squirts out from underneath their tongue, that's where it's coming from. Is the salivary gland openings. Okay, so a little bit deeper on the mouth, specifically the teeth and the tongue. So with your teeth, you have 4 incisors, those are the front teeth, 2, and that's top, just the top here, okay, 2 canines, 4 premolars, so going from front to back, 4 molars, and between 0 and 4 wisdom teeth. How many wisdom teeth you have is largely determined by genetics. Humans are pretty unique in that we have a mixture of different types of teeth. So these front teeth right here, those are the incisors. Okay, the front 2 incisors, 2 on top, 2 on bottom, right there. Versus those incisors are mostly used for biting foods off, whereas the canines are used for shredding foods. So the canines are right here. The premolars and the molars are used for grinding food. So again, humans are unique in that we have all these different varieties of teeth. If you look in the mouth of, say, your cat, they will just have incisors and canines, or they'll just have canines. They're not going to have these molars. So humans are really, really good at taking advantage of all different types of food because our mouth can break down pretty much anything that we want it to. We have all these different types of teeth that specialize in attacking all these different textures. Okay, the number of teeth, the number and type of teeth that you have, though, can change a little bit depending on genetics. Let's look at our tongue. So our tongue is one of the strongest muscles in our body per, given its weight. And the reason why is because it's made of these interlacing bundles of skeletal muscle. So the tongue is kind of like the heart in that it can contract on itself. So the tongue is only attached at one end. It only has an origin. It doesn't have an insertion. So it can't really pull on anything, but it can curl on itself. And that's, again, unique to the heart and to the tongue. And it has a lot of mobility and a lot of agility. It can grip things. It can pack food into this ball. We call that a bolus. It can flip food to the back of the mouth for swallowing. And it can help shape words for speech. Okay, so that's our tongue and that's our teeth. Let's look at our salivary glands. So this image right here is all about salivary glands, although we do see some other structures such as the masseter muscle, right there for chewing, and then the mandible, which is cut in this image. Here's our three salivary glands. The parotid gland, which is right in front of your ear. Right, so that's the biggest one, the parotid gland. And notice that little green thing coming out? That's the parotid duct. The submandibular gland, underneath the mandible, and then the sublingual gland underneath the tongue. So your parotid gland versus your submandibular and sublingual, they will each secrete different types of saliva. And let's see what triggers them to secrete that saliva and what is in that saliva. Okay, so again, here's our three glands, parotid, sublingual, and submandibular. What's in that saliva, first of all? So we have mostly water in there. It is 99.5% water. With the rest of the 0.5%, that's going to be antibodies, that's going to be lysozyme. Remember, lysozyme is an enzyme that helps to break down bacterial cell walls. Defensins, there's mucus, there's that amylase enzyme that I talked about. So the main function of saliva is to help defend against pathogens, because your mouth is a major entry point for those pathogens. And we also begin to break down our carbohydrates. Remember we said convert polysaccharides to disaccharides, so starches to sugars. So that's what our saliva does. And again, fun fact, you make about 1.5 liters of spit per day. Gross. So looking at our at what controls salivation, and hold on just one sec, guys. Okay, guys, sorry about that. Just got life interrupted a little bit there. Okay, so when we're talking about what controls salivation, it's our autonomic nervous system. Surprise, surprise, you do not have conscious control over salivation. So remember, the two branches of our autonomic nervous system includes the parasympathetic branch and the sympathetic branch. The parasympathetic branch, we usually think of it as the rest and digest branch, whereas the sympathetic branch is kind of like fight or flight. So the parasympathetic branch, what it does is it actually stimulates you to secrete saliva so you can, you guessed it, rest and digest. The sympathetic nervous system, on the other hand, makes your mouth really dry. This is why when you get nervous, like you're giving a class presentation or something, your mouth gets dry. It's because your sympathetic nervous system is being activated at that point. So your parasympathetic nervous system will work differently on the different salivary glands. Your submandibular and your sublingual glands produce just enough saliva to keep the mouth moist during the day. The parotid gland is the heavy hitter, though. The parotid gland kicks in and really triggers the release of a lot of saliva when you're hungry or when you're about to puke, too. So when food's going to go the opposite way, out of your mouth. You've ever had that feeling? You probably know what I'm talking about. Where, when you're really nauseous and your mouth starts watering, things are about to get bad. Well, that's your parasympathetic nervous system for you, doing its job. How it does this is by releasing the neurotransmitter acetylcholine to to receptors within these glands called muscarinic receptors. And again, hopefully this is a little bit of review from last quarter. Your sympathetic nervous system, we won't worry too much about what neurotransmitter and receptor combination is used there. However, you've probably heard of certain drugs such as atropine, scopolamine, Benadryl, etc. And these, they treat various things. Atropine, as an example, is used to treat a low heart rate, and it's used especially during anesthesia. So these drugs all work as what are called anticholinergic drugs. Think anticholinergic acetylcholine. So anticholinergic drugs block the effects of acetylcholine, which means they block the effects of the parasympathetic nervous system, which means that they make your mouth dry out, along with a whole bunch of other physiological effects. So Benadryl is an anticholinergic drug, and that's why it causes dry mouth as a side effect. Okay, so before we continue on past the mouth, we have to kind of take a step back, and we're going to talk about tissue layers yet again. I know you probably got this back in Bio 241. Guess what? It's coming back here. I'm sorry. So all of the organs in the GI tract from here on out, except for the accessory organs, except for the liver, pancreas, gallbladder, etc., they have these 4 layers of tissue. Histology is the study of tissues, by the way. So there's the mucosa layer. That's our mucous membrane. We have what's called the submucosa layer of tissue. We have the muscularis externa, and then the serosa, or serous membrane. Let me show you a picture of this to help us kind of visualize this first, and then we'll come back and we'll detail out these layers. So here's a picture of your esophagus. Remember, everything down from here on out, from the mouth onwards, is going to have these 4 layers. And give me a second, just getting out my pen here. The very, very inner layer is our mucous membrane, also known as simply mucosa. And that mucous membrane is going to be made of a variety of tissues depending on where we are. And that in the esophagus, because there's a lot of friction going on, we need multiple layers, multiple cell layers within that mucous membrane. We're going to have that stratified squamous epithelium there. How likely are you to recommend Windows 10? Go away. Okay. Underneath the mucous membrane, we have the submucosa. And the submucosa, you can see, is right here. It's a very different texture compared to the mucous membrane. And then underneath the submucosa layer, we have the muscularis externa. The muscularis externa right here. And that's made of smooth muscle. So we don't have conscious control over it. There are 2 layers of smooth muscle there, the circular layer and then the longitudinal layer. We'll actually see a better picture of this when we get to the stomach. And then we have the outer layer. In most organs, we would have, instead of this adventitia thing here, we would have, remember, a serous membrane, and that's the visceral serous membrane. Remember, the visceral serous membrane is what clings to the outside of the organs. The only exception to this is actually the esophagus. So the esophagus has what's called a tunica adventitia, and we have seen that word before, the term before, the tunica adventitia. We saw it with our blood vessels, actually. The tunica adventitia was the outer layer of our blood vessels. So the esophagus is going to be the only organ in the GI tract to have an adventitia instead. Okay. So again, diving a little bit deeper into each of these layers, here's our mucous membrane layer first. We have the epithelial layer closest to the inside. We call the inside of any hollow organ, by the way, the lumen. And, all of your GI tract organs are hollow, so they all have lumens. So closest to that lumen is the epithelial layer, and in the esophagus that's going to be stratified squamous, in the stomach it's going to be simple columnar, in the small intestine also simple columnar. Again, all stuff you learned last quarter. Underneath the epithelium we're going to have another layer called the lamina propria. That's going to be mostly areolar connective tissue. and then a couple cells here and there of smooth muscle. That's called the muscularis mucosa. Now, if you go deeper, you get into the submucosa. By the way, if you're doing a dissection of one of these organs, you can actually separate the mucosa from the submucosa. That's why these are considered separate tissue layers. You can actually kind of rip them apart. I know, wonderful visual there, right? Okay, getting into the submucosa. The submucosa is going to mostly be connective tissue, and that connective tissue is going to differ depending on which organ we're talking about. Most of the time it's going to be areolar connective tissue. And within that areolar connective tissue of the submucosa, you can probably see little holes here and there. These little holes are blood vessels, they're nerves, they're glands within there. So this area is richly innervated, it's richly vascularized, and it has also lymph nodes running through there as well. Okay, in that muscularis externa layer, that we're gonna have our smooth muscle, and that smooth muscle helps with movement. The way we move food through our digestive system, it's very, very gross. It's very ungraceful. We do movements called peristalsis and segmentation. Peristalsis is kind of like just squeezing food down through our tubes. So it's kind of like how I imagined. Actually, it's exactly like squeezing the toothpaste out of a toothpaste tube. Okay, you kind of start from the top and just squeeze your way on down. Well, that's what peristalsis does. You start from the top and you squeeze the food down through the tubes that are your GI tract. Segmentation, on the other hand, doesn't really push food along. It just mixes food and churns food and breaks it up into little chunks. We'll see more of this when we get to the stomach. In some areas, you do have a thickening of the muscularis externa, and that forms what are called sphincters or valves. So these sphincters or valves help prevent the backflow of food to where they really shouldn't go. And most sphincters and valves in your digestive system are one way. So once food goes through, it cannot go backwards. The really only real exception to this is from your stomach to your esophagus. As we talked about, you can eject the contents of your stomach. Okay, and we talked about the serous membrane, how what we're looking at is the visceral serosa of most of these organs. Okay, and to take that visceral serosum thing a little bit further here, the way your digestive organs are arranged inside your abdominal cavity, they aren't just kind of squished in, well, they kind of are just squished in there, actually, I take that back. But they are attached to the walls of your abdominal cavity. It's not like if we were just sort of peel you open and then turn you upside down, your intestines wouldn't totally flop out. They are kind of anchored in place. And they're anchored in place by this serous membrane that wraps their outside. And if you remember, maybe, you remember that one type of serous membrane is called the peritoneum. Remember around the heart we had the pericardium, around the lungs we had the pleura, and around the intestines we had the peritoneia? And we had the visceral peritoneia that covered the surface of the intestines and the GI tract, and the parietal peritoneia that lined that abdominal pelvic cavity. So here we're going to bring that back. I'm so sorry. We are going to add one additional piece of information here. This idea of a mesentery. A mesentery. So let me draw your attention to this image over here. This is a spherical model of a human being. Right? And then here is, say, a little bit of small intestine or the stomach. Doesn't matter. Alright. Immediately on the outside, coming into direct contact with the outside surface, is the visceral peritoneum. Remember, the peritoneum is a serous membrane. And then lining the cavity where that organ is sitting is the parietal peritoneum. However, they're not two distinct membranes here. They are actually connected, and that connection point is called a mesentery. A mesentery. Sometimes they can be connected at the back, as we see here. This is a dorsal mesentery. Sometimes they are connected at the front, and here it's called a ventral mesentery. But almost all of your digestive organs are linked to your abdominal pelvic cavity by this mesentery, by this linkage. And through this mesentery, we feed our blood vessels, we feed our lymph vessels, and our nerves. to supply our stomach and to supply our intestines. Now, some organs actually have moved behind the mesentery. So right here, here's an example of an organ that's behind the mesentery, and it can get there either just by developing there in the first place, or the back side of it can be resorbed or dissolved, as denoted by the dotted lines right there. We call those organs retroperitoneal. Retroperitoneal. So they are between the mesentery and the muscles of the back, actually. And your kidneys are the one major example of a retroperitoneal organ. They're, if we were to look at your back and just kind of take away the skeletal muscles of your back, right there you'd see the kidneys with no other membranes, nothing else surrounding them. If we were to do that to your front, we would not directly see your intestines, we would see the parietal peritoneum first. Okay, and to help us visualize this is not a great image, but it works. This is the mesentery of the small intestine, and this is human. So over here, this is a loop of small intestine. A surgeon is stretching out the mesentery here so we can see it. And you can see those blood vessels running through there. Can't really see the lymph, they're a little bit too small. Can't really see the nerves in this picture. The nerves usually run alongside blood vessels. Alright, and this mesentery would connect this loop of small intestine to the abdominal wall. Okay, so the esophagus is one such organ that is encompassed by these visceral and parietal peritonia, and it's anchored by a mesentery. All right, all the organs from here on out are, unless we say so. Okay, looking at the esophagus, what does it do? What's its function? It's a food tube. It's a food tube for swallowing. Our trachea was the air tube, the esophagus is the food tube. And our esophagus is actually a lot smaller than you would think. The trachea is really, really big, and the esophagus is actually posterior to the trachea. It's right behind the trachea, and it's a lot smaller. There are two major sphincters within the esophagus, two rings of smooth muscle that hopefully make sure things don't go backwards, although sometimes those don't always work. We call the upper sphincter, or the top sphincter, the upper esophageal sphincter, and the lower sphincter, the lower esophageal or cardiac sphincter. And I know you're looking at the name going, what the F? Cardiac sphincter? Okay, somebody was drinking when they named that. Well, in this case, it kind of does make sense. A little bit. Not much, but a little bit. The cardiac sphincter is called the cardiac sphincter because it's right next to the heart. So where your esophagus joins the top of your stomach is where that cardiac sphincter is, and that also happens to be right next to the heart. Okay, so I'm not going to get here yet. When you swallow, it's actually a pretty complicated process. You need your tongue doing its proper job. You need all those nerves, those cranial nerves that are controlling the tongue and that are controlling swallowing. They all need to be working properly. So if you have damage, brain damage, you may not be able to swallow very well. If you age and your nerves degenerate, one of the first things that happens is you lose your ability to swallow very well. So, when we swallow, our tongue will flip that food to the back of our mouth and send it down the esophagus. And remember, we have that flap of tissue called the epiglottis that makes sure the food stays in the esophagus and doesn't go into the trachea. And the esophagus, actually, it'll even work if you turn on your head, if you turn upside down. So the esophagus will push food down into the stomach by using these small contractions of its muscularis externa layer. Remember, we have a muscularis externa layer. These small little contractions to push food down into the stomach. Those small little contractions are called peristalsis. So I know that little image is really, really tantalizing, but ignore the animation just for now. Here's peristalsis here on the right. Here we are contracting a little bit of that smooth muscle ring in order to move the bolus, or the ball, of food further down. And again, this works even if you stand on your head. Now, whenever I look at this picture, I think that this happens fairly slowly, but this is actually quite fast. So in this picture over here, let me see if I can outline it. Oop. right there that I just circled, that's the trachea, and then behind it is the esophagus. And you can't quite see the peristaltic movements. You kind of have to watch it several times, but they're there, I promise. Okay, this video was from someone, by the way, who was having trouble swallowing, so they took a special image of them swallowing a radioactive substance, and then took a picture as they were swallowing, or took a video as they were swallowing. Okay, let's move on to the stomach. Well, actually, let me check my time. Well, the stomach will be in the next lecture then, because we're hitting about 30 minutes, and I don't know about you guys, but I need to go pee. So I'll see you back here in just a moment.